she rises way hey, and up she rises way hey, and up she rises early in the morning.
All right, folks, picking up where we left off last time, this time we're going to talk about the biological concept of what a different species is and how evolution and some of the mechanisms within evolution that allow new species to arise. So the first thing we got to come up with is, what is a species? How can we tell if two organisms are members of the same species or a different species? The core, oldest fashioned way to do it is if you can get two different organisms together, and if they can mate and produce fertile offspring, like their kids can have kids, I mean, that's what we need for a species. Right? Evolution was all about being able to pass on your genes to the next generation. If you can't pass on your genes, you're not the same species. So we look here, what kind of animal is this, Miss Ripley?
It's a horse, I do believe.
Of course.
Here. Of course.
That's a donkey.
That is a donkey, and when you can put them all together, what do you get?
Depends on the sex of the two that bred, but usually a mule.
Or it's not a hornky?
I think it's a hinny.
A hinny. That
the
is
other one. It depends on which one is which.
A hinny actually was a very popular riding horse for clergy back in the Middle Ages.
Ooh.
Believe it or not. Mules were much
more
mules. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, you can mix a horse and a donkey, you can get a mule or a hinny. Can a mule or a hinny like mate with another mule or hinny and get another hinny or mule?
Don't think so.
No such luck.
They are not fertile. Horses and donkeys, their genes line up well enough. Like two horses mate, right? Every single gene pair is going to line up. They're going to have two alleles for every gene. Okay. Same thing with a donkey. A horse and a donkey, most of them line up, but there's a few that just don't quite match, right? But it's a small enough number that they match enough that they can produce a mule. But the mules, their DNA is just too screwed up. They can't produce with another mule. They're all sterile. So they are technically not the same species. They're about as close as you can get. The same genus, but they are not the same species. And there's other ways you can look at it. You can look at, the bone structure. You can look at the DNA, see how similar they are there. But the hard, fast, they're the same species or not is, could they mate and have fertile offspring?
So where do new species come from? We kind of touched on this at the end of our last video. So speciation is our scientific word for the formation of a new species. How does this happen? Well, we know that there's variation in natural selection, right? We've covered that in the last two videos. And that's acting on these different variations. If members of the same species are exposed to different environmental conditions, say in maybe a long story told by Mr. Hamele in the last video, like the Hamele bears, the Hamele bears, some were going to Canada, some were going to Guatemala, they were experiencing different environmental conditions. So what's going to happen? The next slide only knows.
So we refer to that condition where members of the same species or of a population find themselves exposed to different environmental selective pressures. We call that isolation. And there are different ways that organisms can become isolated, but the idea here is that there's a separation which occurs within a population of members of the same species. This allows differences to accumulate in their respective populations, right? Remember, again, evolution occurs at that population level. So in the Hamele bear, Hamele bear story, some genes were beneficial in one environment but disadvantageous in another, and vice versa. Because of that isolation and those different selective pressures, well, now all of a sudden certain traits are more common in one group and less common in one group. And the longer that occurs and the more, I'd say, extreme the differences are, then the more different those organisms are going to look from each other. And given enough time, they could be so different that they wouldn't recognize each other as the same species anymore, and or be unable to even reproduce with each other anymore. Should I go ahead and do the other types then, or are we going to cycle through?
Sure, we say beforehand we're also each going to do one.
Yeah, then you broke
you want to take the next one.
No, you were the one who stopped that trend. You did 2 slides in a row to start us off.
That was,
Non-title slides.
I did a title slide and a non-title slide.
No, you did what is a
Oh
species?
my goodness, stop,
And
I did that slide,
move on.
that slide. And then it was Ripley.
Yep.
Wow.
You
I am so wrong.
are. What's
You
new?
know, you must have just talked so long it felt like 2.
All right, so types of isolation. Geographic is the easiest to comprehend, and the one we'll focus on most. It's where populations are separated by a physical or geographic barrier, something that keeps them from being able to physically get together and swap genes. Okay, they just can't get together. It could be just distance, like in the bio bears one we did, where we had the population of biology teacher bears in Wisconsin, and some went north, some went south, and the ones up north eventually wound up looking more like Hamles, and the ones down south wound up looking more like Kemeters. Okay, that was geographic isolation. They were separated by distance, or they could be some barrier like a river, a mountain, ocean, land. On the 2 sides of Grand Canyon, there are 2 different species of squirrel. Okay, because they're separated by the Grand Canyon. It's too hard for them to get across the Grand Canyon to try to mate with each other. Okay, you look away across, if you're a little squirrel. I mean, the Grand Canyon is hard to get down and up if you're a human, but if you're a little squirrel, it's not going to happen. So that separation keeps them from mating. Now, if there's a bridge put across the Grand Canyon, those 2 squirrels can get to the other sides, and they can start mixing their genes. Well, then no, you no longer have geographic isolations. If these Guatemalan and Hudson's Bay bears had some sort of
Great Bear Highway.
Great Bear Highway, or
The GBH, yeah.
Great Bear Highway, or some sort of teleportation machine all this time, so they could mix with each other, right? They'd have little social mixers and then get together and talk about the old times back in Wisconsin, whatever. But then, whatever changes were happening up north, like fatter and whiter being beneficial, and the changes were happening down south, the second you get them back together, as long as they're still able to mate, that kind of dilutes that change that's happening, right? It would slow it down. So if you can get complete isolation, whatever changes happen up north, chances the same things happening down in the different environment are very slim. And not only do you have different variations that you're starting out with, you also get mutations. Like, what if a bear up north has mutation that makes it pink? Is there much chance that variation is going to happen down south? No. Now, I'm not saying pink's going to be a good variation, but those mutations are all random, right? So over time, more and more mutations build up in the 2 different populations to the point where they're just so different, like Kendra said, they can't get back together. That's geographic.
That's where Care Bears come from too, right?
Yes, because they're isolated up in the clouds.
Yep.
All right, next type of isolation is behavioral, which is a little bit less like concrete to think about. So populations are capable of breeding, but they don't due to differences in courtship, rituals, behaviors. And so if you think a lot about like birds, if we have kind of those complex like mating dances or rituals, or you have like the penguins that have to like find the perfect pebble to give to their mate. If you're, trying to mix those things together, the birds are not going to understand it. They're going to be confused. They're going to be like, what's going on? So even though they could in theory produce fertile offspring together, they don't kind of recognize those things. Apparently we have some human examples on the slide here of, if you're going on dates, right, where you choose to eat. Apparently, maybe you're going to sing your date a mating song. Maybe you're a morning person and they're a night person, so you're not going to see them at, like the same time or something weird. It just doesn't work out, right? So imagine you're dating someone and instead of flowers, you're given calculus problems. What are the odds of a second date?
Pretty high, I think.
I would say I would, go for it and be like, oh yeah, we're going to do some calculus problems together. It's a match. So yeah, this can be anything that is you kind of, are reacting to like, yeah, I don't know about that. That's a behavioral isolation. So in theory, technically they could produce offspring, but there's some sort of difference in behavior that leads them to choose not to.
And that could be as simple as like on a human scale, if you're a more carnivorous human versus a vegan, and so the carnivorous human is probably more likely to spend time in social gatherings, at restaurants like 88 or something like that, where the vegan is more likely to spend time at places that are more catered to vegans. Who are you more likely to run into and maybe be interested in and ask out on a date? Well, the people you're more likely to see, right? So that would be a very subtle form, but that would still be a form of behavioral isolation. There's going to not be as much mixing just because of where you choose to eat, for instance. I mean, there's some birds that do that on the Galapagos Islands we may talk about later.
Is that dating apps would be a behavioral isolating effect too? Which
like dating app are you choosing to use?
What are the dating apps out there right now?
I don't even know. Anyway, here's where the real rubber meets the road for isolation, and that is reproductive isolation. That's when there are so many differences between the two populations that they are actually incapable of reproducing with one another anymore. Just like with the horse and the donkey, they've just crossed that threshold where any new mutations that pop up in the horse population can't be shared with the donkey population because there's no way to produce offspring that would then pass those traits on, and vice versa. Nothing that pops up that's new in the donkey population can be passed to the horse population. So those two populations remain separate, and over time, the more time that passes, the more differences are going to arise, and the more different they are going to become.
So we already looked at this slide in the last one. We just wanted to reiterate a little bit here is the idea of common ancestors or common descent. If we look at this kind of this family tree for things in the dog cat family up here, we've got cats and skunks and otters and dogs and wolves. They're all related if you go back far enough. At some point, every time we see a branch in this family tree, that signals that there was an isolation event. Don't exactly know what it was, but these ones continued evolving one way, and these had different environmental impacts that caused them to evolve slightly differently, right? Different mutations and different environmental influences cause these breaks. So this is what you would see in a family, quote unquote, family tree or a cladogram of different species here. And if you follow that back far enough, you find this common ancestor that all of these had, that had the traits that are common to all of them. And this is what we generally think of when we think of evolution, this common descent and things becoming more and more different. Now, there are a couple different types of evolution, which Mr. Kemmeter and Ms. Ripley will talk about next. One of them is basically what we've been talking about so far. The other one's a little different. So let's go to that.
And yeah, it can be maybe a little misleading or confusing at first. Until we take a look at this here. So what we've been talking about thus far is divergent evolution, and the term diverge means to like go separate ways. So in divergent evolution, a population that is starting off as one is becoming two different populations, or eventually two different species potentially. So the gradual accumulation of differences between different populations over time. This is divergent evolution. However, the opposite can also happen, which can be a little confusing until you think about why it's happening. Oh, sorry. I was leading someone to another slide, so more on that one later.
In a second, after we talk about this, which I guess you guys like me to pronounce all of the homogeneous, homozygous, homologous structures. As we know, the prefix homo means the same, because we've learned several words that have that prefix. And so homologous structures are structures in different organisms that share similarities due to that common ancestry. So again, if we think about that family tree, way back when they all had this common ancestor, and since then they've kind of branched apart into all these different species we see. But if we are to kind of look at these different forearms in the picture, we can find that they all have the same bones. So they have, you can see kind of color coded, the top one there we have in white, and so it's in every single kind of forearm. If we move down, we've got kind of a yellow and a red together in every single forearm. So all the bones are still there. They've just changed kind of shape and size and what their function is over time. So this again kind of points to everything came from this common ancestor. As they kind of were isolated and started separating out into those different species, we see all these different changes that obviously happened over a really long time, but all the same kind of bones are there from that original common ancestor.
You mind if I add just one thing, Mr.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we see here it's one bone, then two bones, then little bones, and long bones, right? One bone, two bone, little bone, long bones. It's like a Dr. Seuss book. And we see that same pattern all the way through here. But all these arms do very different functions, right? We've got a slow crawl, a way to fly and soar, swimming well, running well, a different way to fly, grabbing things, all using the same basic original blueprint from this ancestral tetrapod up here, which means 4 feet. Took that same thing, and all you had to do, you didn't have to make up new bones or anything. You just had to take that shape of that bone and make it a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, or change the angle of the joint. Each of those little things is a very small mutation, really, but they add up to making things that on the outside might look very different, but when you peel away the skin and the muscle, man, it's really all the same. Okay, just, you know, these ones are wider and don't have as much articulation. This one's got more articulation. It's a little finer. This one is more robust, whereas the bat is really light for flight. But it's just a difference in the thickness or the angle of the bones makes this difference. And so it, once again, points to that common ancestor, these homologous or similar structures. Cameron, do you want to do this one?
Was that
yourself up?
That'll count as
yeah, so
That'll count as mine.
Here's the rest of that thought. So we were talking about divergent evolution being the accumulation of differences. We do see evolution that causes organisms to look more similar, which until we investigate further might make us think that things that are not closely related might be. A good example down here, sharks and dolphins. They look very similar. Dark gray top, lighter bottom. They've got a streamlined shape. They've got flippers. They've got a dorsal fin. But sharks are a type of fish, and dolphins are a mammal. Sharks breathe through gills. Dolphins breathe air. So sharks are cold-blooded, and dolphins are warm-blooded, because they live in the same environment, which has the same selective pressures. Their genes, their bodies, their traits are acted upon in the same way. There's a specific advantage to having a darker colored top and a lighter colored bottom. As prey is hunting from up above, looking down in the water, the background is dark beneath them, so they blend in better. If you're below and you're looking up, a lighter underbelly is going to blend you in with the lighter sky up above. So those aren't shared characteristics because of common ancestry. They didn't inherit them from a common ancestor, but the environment molded them to look similar.
Yeah, and I mean, sharks don't even have bones, right? They cartilaginous skeletons, whereas dolphins have a bone, and dolphins go up and down, and sharks go side to side. I mean, they are not really at all alike if you go inside, but the general shape, like Mr. Kemmer said, that is convergent. They come together. And that's the analogous structures, which I guess I'll take. All right, analogous means we did the cell analogies earlier in the year, right? The nucleus is like the manager of the factory, controls what goes on, and that kind of thing. Well, here, things that have convergent evolution become more similar. On the outside, you might say, oh, these probably have a common ancestor because they all have this fin that helps them swim, right? Seems like a similar structure. But when you take a look at it, look how different the structures are inside. It tells you that they don't have a common ancestor. Okay, so that means they are analogous structures and they have convergent evolution. So similar functions, different structure, as opposed to homologous structures, which are similar structure, different functions.
And I guess that's it for this video. We apparently might have some more Hamele made videos along the way for some of these other topics, but these 3 videos are the main kind of core stuff of evolution that we need you guys to know about. And that's that. And I guess we're putting our hats on our faces like beaks.
They look like beaks or oh, I need 2 of them. Could have one coming out of each side.
One stays. New mask type. All right.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Hold on, bro. Bye-bye.